we don't know, but if it's storm damage, come over here and tell us why you think it's storm damage. I mean, you're an expert at this. We're not. He gets out of the car and he comes over there and he goes, this ain't storm damage. Oh, okay, cool. All right, we're not wasting our time. And then now he's just staring at the crop and he's, how the hell did that happen? I've never seen anything like this. By the time he was walking out of there going, oh, shit. Yeah, it was very cool. It's like, yeah, light bulb went on, didn't it? Yeah. Yeah, that was fun, though, just because he was really nice, but it was like, oh, yeah. Oh, Lord, yeah. Yeah, quit cameras. Yeah. Hang on, I need another water. Yeah, they got a pitcher and some glasses with ice water, but then there's this if you want. All right, ready? All right. Yeah. Is the director and co-founder of the Independent Crop Circle Research Association, or the ICCRA. He has been researching crop circles and related phenomenon for 14 years. He's personally examined and researched more than 100 crop circles in the United States and the United Kingdom. He has contributed to the Crop Circle Connector webpage, the Crop Circle News, numerous other publications, including newspapers. You guys remember newspapers? It's the big sheets of paper they throw on your lawn. Remember those? All right. Just checking. I wish I could get them to stop throwing newspapers on my front lawn, because I don't read them. I don't have a parrot. So anyway. Newspapers. He's also been interviewed numerous times by Linda Howe on the Earth Files program. He's been on numerous television and radio shows, including George Norrie's Coast to Coast. He has a master's degree in general science from Eastern Michigan University. If you're wondering whether the guy is a good observer, if it hasn't been clear that he might be, he also has taught university-level astronomy courses. He's helped operate and maintain the Scherzer Observatory. He is a certified severe weather observer for the National Weather Service. Sorry. Now, when he was working on his master's degree, he wanted to do his thesis about crop circles, but he couldn't get academic backing for that. So instead, he was given a grant for his thesis by NASA through the Michigan Space Grant Consortium to analyze and map geological reflection data from the Lunar Prospector mission. He is a board member of the Friends of the Serpent Mound. He is also a contributing member to the Hanwalken Center for Prehistoric Astronomy, Cosmology, and Landscape Studies. He is a volunteer member of the Ohio Historical Society and a member of the Serpent Mound chapter of the American Society of Dowsers. He is also I love this last line, enthusiastically and happily married to Delcy Wilson. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Wilson.
How's everybody doing? I'd really like to thank Lee Clinton and the staff here of the Ozark Conference for inviting me. I think that this is my first time to Arkansas, and it has been a lot of fun so far. At the very end, I'll give you a little snippet of Arkansas crop circle news that I just got this week, so stay tuned for that. I'd also like to thank Linda Moulton Howe, probably more than anybody recommended me to speak here, so I think that shout out goes to Linda Howe. How many people have been here at this conference before? Quite a number. That's good. How many people have some level of knowledge about crop circles? Excellent. I'm glad that I skipped to the advanced course. Okay. I was actually requested this year by Lee Clinton to talk specifically about the relationship between crop circles and Native American earthworks. And so when I first started putting this presentation together, I've done presentations around the country and incorporated some of this material at various levels. I compiled all of my slides, my PowerPoint slides together for it, and I had 289 slides. That's way, way more than we can fit in the time allotted. So I've actually cut it down by 2/3, and so you're only getting about 1/3 of the information. But I hope that this will give everybody a bit of insight into how sophisticated and complex the study of crop circles really is, first of all, and also to maybe change your perception a little bit about what crop circles really are. And hopefully you'll enjoy what we see. So if you can strap your seatbelts on, we are going to fly through some of this information to get you through to the end. So let's begin with a simple question. What are crop circles? Right? This is the advanced course, right? Let's start out with a simple definition. Crop circles are swirled and flattened areas and patterns found primarily in agricultural fields, primarily. Would everybody agree with that statement? Okay. So let's start out with a quote or an idea by a crop circle researcher from the early 1990s, a gentleman by the name of Michael Korost, who wrote a paper as a graduate assistant at Princeton University titled Thesis for a Pre-Paradigm Science Cereology. What Korost was saying in his paper, his identifying the study of crop circles as a pre-paradigm science. How many people know what that term paradigm means? Few people, okay. Paradigm was coined by a gentleman, sort of a philosopher of science, a guy by the name of Thomas Kuhn at Harvard University back in the 1960s, wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he introduced the term paradigm and the term paradigm shift to describe ways of viewing knowledge from both within and beyond the field of science. Okay? Now, what Korost was saying as a pre-paradigm science was that the rules hadn't been written on how to study crop circles. Right? We have all kinds of various scientific disciplines, and the rules on how to study any one of those scientific disciplines have already been developed. But the study of crop circles have no rules, right? There were no rules at the time. How do you study this? It was very new and very unusual, and people attempted to apply rules and techniques and methodologies for studying crop circles from various disciplines, but that the rules for cereology hadn't been written. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go forward through this material, because I have a comment about where I think crop circles fit in today, and it may change your paradigm view about what crop circles are. It may shift that a little bit. So in the ICCRA, the organization that I represent, we have generally applied scientific methodologies for the last 10 years or so, looking at crop circles. And so we start out with what we call level 1 analysis. Let's see if this laser works or not. It looks like it's not working. Okay, not working. Let's try this. There we go. Level 1 analysis. That's where we collect basic objective information about the crop circles that we go into. And we do that with a whole series of tests. We use a test that we've labeled the LNEAT, that stands for the Levengood node elongation analysis test. And that's basically where you go out and measure growth nodes. We do various plant and soil tests. We will measure for electromagnetic fluctuations. We will look for increases in radioactivity. We will use a magnetometer. We will do all kinds of ground measurements. All of that scientific stuff, we go out to document crop circles, and we will make an evaluation based on those tests as to whether a crop circle is man-made, here, man-made. Inconclusive, we don't collect enough evidence to make a determination, or if we can determine that it's authentic based on this information here, we will say it's not mechanically made by people. All right? And if we can get to that point, then we move to a level 2 analysis where we'll start to study the geometry or the symbols, or we'll do diatonic ratio analysis and a whole bunch of other stuff, including the stuff that I'm going to show you today. But I wanted to give you this as a sort of a prelude so that you understand the methodology that we undertake when we look at a crop circle. It's very comprehensive. And all of these sort of things are the rules that are starting to be written about how to study crop circles. We're using various scientific disciplines to help us understand what's really going on. It's a little bit like using forensics techniques, because a crop circle really is a trace, right? It's what's left behind after something has happened. And so we use those tests to help us determine what made the trace. And we try to avoid doing any sort of level 2 analysis or study on anything down here, because frankly, we think it's a big waste of time. So I'm not going to talk about hoaxes. I'm not going to go into all of the scientific results that we've gotten, because this is specifically about one aspect of our studies. And I just wanted to give you this as a sort of a start to understand where we come from. Now, after several years of looking at and documenting crop circles, up to the present time, we have found that crop circles don't appear anywhere in the landscape or everywhere in the landscape, but they appear with certain sort of contextual features around it. In 95% of all of the crop circles in the United States that we've determined not to be man-made, 95% have 3 criteria. They appear very close to power lines. 85% of the 95%, the closest power line pole to where the crop circle is has a transformer box on it, which is unusual. Not all power line poles have that. It also, crop circles come down near some body of water, creek, pond, drainage ditch, underground aquifer, lake, whatever, you name it, water is present, very close by. The third is that they appear on the downslope or at the bottom of a hill or at the lowest point in the field. All right? So you have those 3 criteria that take place in 95% of the cases. In the other 5% of the cases, you probably have 2 of the 3. Now, there's a 4th criteria that seems to have a very high correlation, and that is in 65% of the formations, they are coming down in very close proximity to Native American earthworks or other ancient archaeological sites. And so it's a bit like my friend Dr. Charles Lietzau, who was in the ICCRA, he kind of coined this idea. He says that to a painter, to start to have a painting, you got to have the brushes, you got to have your canvas, you got to have your various tools before you can paint your painting, right? These criteria have to be present in order for a crop circle to arrive. That it's just overwhelmingly, that's the number. In this 65%, we actually think that that number is probably higher, But because so many of the ancient mounds and earthworks have been obliterated, and there are very few records on some of that stuff, we think that number was probably higher at one point. And so we're going to talk about this down here. We're going to talk about what that really means and what that is. All right, so it turns out that the greatest number of crop circles reported every year, I'm sure you're aware, is in southern England, amidst a landscape of these kinds of earthworks there. Avebury, Silbury Hill, Stonehenge, Barbary Castle. The area there is literally filled with these kinds of ancient earthworks. Well, the greatest number of crop circles that appear in the United States each year also come down in a landscape of these kinds of earthworks. The state that has had the most reported crop circles to date, dating all the way back in our records to the early 1800s, is the state of Ohio. How many people know about the prehistory of the state of Ohio? Few. Okay. Ohio was the central place for a couple of the earliest sophisticated cultures and mound building cultures that ever existed in the United States. They existed in southern Ohio, and most people know them by the common names of the Adena and the Hopewell, and they started building mounds as far back as 1000 BC. And they continued building, the Hopewell continued building mounds until about maybe 600 AD. And then there was a later culture that came into Ohio known as the Fort Ancient, somewhere around 1100 AD, which was a concurrent culture with the Mississippian culture. Many people in this part of the country know that because they built big pyramidal structures like at Cahokia and places like that. And so we're going to focus on some of the crop circles that appeared in Ohio and in Wisconsin, and we're going to talk specifically about that so that you understand what that relationship really is and what does that mean. Just to give you a sense, this crop circle here happened near a little town called Bainbridge, and there were earthworks all through this valley. And this is actually the closest one to this formation. It's a mound called Serpent Mound, part of a large complex of earthworks, the Serpent Mound earthworks. And we'll talk more about that one specifically later. So let's just make a couple comparisons to identify, okay, in England, there's Avebury's circle. In Ohio, we have the Great Circle at Newark. It's about maybe 100 feet less in diameter, but very, very similar in its construction. Avebury was actually a much bigger complex of earthworks. You can see from this old map done by William Stuckey. David Wyrick did a map in the 1800s that showed the extent of all of the earthworks around the city of Newark, of which this circle is this circle right here. All these other earthworks existed and are mostly now gone. The only other major section that still exists is this circle here connected to this octagon. And it's an amazing place, but very similar kinds of earthwork structures. Here we have, in England, Silbury Hill. People are very familiar with that, largest intact conical mound in Europe. And in Ohio, we have the Great Miamisburg Mound. This is actually the second largest conical mound in the United States, but very similar kinds of construction. People are maybe familiar with Barbary Castle, which is a hilltop earthwork. In Ohio, there are a whole bunch of these hilltop earthworks, Fort Hill being one in this area where a lot of crop circles have come down. Of course, people are familiar with Stonehenge, but many people are not familiar that Stonehenge started out as a long earthwork. There's a circle and an earthwork pathway there. Stonehenge, of course, has all kinds of astronomical alignments built into it, as does Serpent Mound in southern Ohio. Serpent Mound built maybe as far back as contemporary with Stonehenge. We don't know. It's hard to date Serpent Mound at this point. So with that in mind, just to give you those kinds of comparisons, let's take a single case study as our starting point. And this case study happened in Wisconsin back in 2003. This particular crop circle happened in a very small town in sort of mid-Wisconsin, known as Mayville, and it was very close to another town called Kokoski. So Mayville, Kokoski, Wisconsin, kind of in between the two. Now this crop circle is important for a lot of reasons. If you haven't heard about it, I encourage you to go out to our website and read our initial field report about it, because it goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to talk about here. But the most important piece of this is that it was eyewitnessed by someone. It actually formed in front of his eyes. Now, there are other cases of people seeing and eyewitnessing crop circles happen in the daytime. There are about 50, if you haven't heard of them. About 50 people around the world have seen crop circles form, and they all report essentially the same thing, that the crop circle happens in less than 15 seconds. And that's what happened here. And typically, they happen during the passage of a weather front, which happened here. So we'll talk about some of the details. On the 4th of July in 2003, about 7:30 in the morning, the gentleman by the name of Art Rantella, who was a recently retired truck driver, got up, got used to getting up early in the mornings, turned on the TV, and saw that there was going to be a severe weather front passing through his area very soon. He's a weather aficionado. He went out to his workshop, which sits on top of a hill, and started to make some coffee and was just going to sit there to watch the weather go by. All right, so he's sitting by the window, waiting for the weather to go by. The weather front hits about 7:40, and the first thing he notices is the tree outside the workshop window. This is the tree. The bark starts coming off the tree. Very severe weather, wind blowing, right? And then he looks across the street and he sees that the trees are starting to sway violently. And that takes his gaze over there, and he looks a little bit over, and then he sees as this crop circle forms, the wheat starts to waver back and forth and it swirls down. Then a second one the wheat starts to waver and it swirls down. Then a third one, right in the center, wheat starts to waver and it swirls down in that length of time. As long as it took me to describe that, that's how long it went down. All right? So we went to visit Art Rantella. This is actually the view from his workshop window, looking out. He had a very good view of it. It was framed on a hill facing him, and he's on top of a hill looking down on it. You couldn't have asked for a sort of a better view. You can see the power lines running by here. There's actually a creek back here where the trees are. So we have the water, we have the power lines. He saw no unusual lights, no unusual sounds, just this weather front going by. Now, what's important about this eyewitness case, as compared to all the other eyewitness cases that have been documented, is that this is the first eyewitness case in which there has been some geometry to the crop circle. All of the rest of them have been simple circles that have been seen, but this one has geometry to it, so it's important for that reason. All right, so we went up and visited. We authenticated this crop circle as not being man-made, independently of Art Rantella's eyewitness story. We did the L-neat, we measured the nodes, we found expulsion cavities, we did all kinds of scientific tests I'm not going to go into. But there's Art Rantella and Roger Sugden, a gentleman I've been investigating crop circles with since 1996. He and I and Dr. Charles Lietzau went up there to talk with Art and investigate this crop circle. You can see the geometry. One little interesting feature, the wheat tips in some cases had been kind of twirled around like a curlicue. All right, so there are all kinds of other anomalies present that I'm not going to get into. Now, it may be hard for some people way in the back to see this map, so I'm going to describe it for you. But this is the sort of area map off of Google Earth Pro that I've located where this crop circle took place. Mayville, Kokoski, right there. Now, I've also noted on this map where all of these other earthworks that are nearby that were located in this area. For those that are not familiar with Wisconsin, Wisconsin is filled with all kinds of effigy mounds, shapes of birds and bears and animals and all kinds of four-legged creatures, buffaloes, whatever. They are typically found in huge groupings, 40, 50, 60 of them in a grouping. And they were built more than 1,000 years ago in southern Wisconsin and extending a little bit into eastern Iowa. And so this crop circle took place in this area where all of this stuff is happening. And I want to talk about one of those specifically, one of the closest ones to where this crop circle came down, known as the Coulterman Mound Group and Petriform. It's very, very unknown, even amongst archaeological circles. Almost nobody knows about this site. You can barely see these sort of little humps here are the remnants of a series of effigy mounds. And there is a petroform. For those not familiar with that term, petro meaning rock, form meaning some kind of figure. So there was a figure created with stones also at this site. And that actually plays a very interesting role in what I'm going to talk about. So this is actually one of the earliest mound groupings in Wisconsin that was dated using carbon dating. It dated to about 770 AD, so more than 1,000 years ago. The petroform itself was discovered by a friend of mine by the name of Herman Bender, who is the president of the Hanwacken Center for Prehistoric Astronomy, Cosmology, and Landscape Studies. And he did a whole several series of papers about this site, which is just amazing. And you can see that all that identifies this site is this little sign by the side of the road that just says effigy mounds. That's it. You could drive by and never even know it's there. One of the interesting things about this site is on one of the stones, it had a Thunderbird petroglyph inscribed in it. Now, in Plains tribes, the Thunderbird is sometimes known by the term the Wikinian. And the word Kinyan in Dakota means winged. But the Wakin part is roughly translated to mean the Great Spirit. Other tribes have various similar kind of terminology for that concept. The Algonquins had the idea of the Manitou. The Iroquois had something called the Orenda, and it meant extraordinary or sacred power. And so it's interesting that this figure was inscribed on one of the stones there. Now, the petroform itself, Herman Bender describes it and has been identified in several different Native American traditions and mythologies as something known as the star being. And it's this sort of elongated layout of stones that are roughly connected. And one of those stones is the one that had the Thunderbird petroglyph on it. Now, this is actually the Coulterman layout on the right, and this is the constellation of Libra and Scorpius combined on the left. It's a mirror image, all right? And in astronomy, we're all kind of familiar with the Greek constellations that have come down to us from Western culture. But other cultures around the world didn't connect the dots the same in the sky, right? So the Native Americans in this country didn't, identify like any of the zodiacal constellations as being the zodiacal constellation. Like Libra wasn't Libra to them. They kind of combined the two, Scorpius and Libra, and combined them together to make a different form. And they had their own mythology surrounding various sort of astronomical alignments up in the sky. And so this one was known as the star being. Now, what's interesting about the tradition of the star being is that in tribal lore, it's considered to be the harbinger or the return of the Thunderbirds. And so when this constellation or asterism rises in the sky in the springtime. It sort of telegraphs the return of when the thunderstorms begin. The Thunderbirds come. And so there is this sort of interesting concept about that, and that the Pawnee saw the stars of Scorpius, the bottom part of that, as something known as the real snake, which heralded the thunder's return. So different tribes, even though they may have called it something slightly different, still meant sort of essentially the same thing. Now, what this specific rising of this asterism did was it did something known as quartering time and space. Many people are familiar with the Native American concept of the four directions. That's quartering the circle, right? It's quartering time and space, and it's a very key Native American concept which plays a role in this study of the connection between the crop circles and these Native American earthworks. And that this sort of asterism of the star being and the star people associated with that marks the return of spring and brings the return of the Thunderbirds and the Thunder beings. So this is the idea of quartering time and space. North, south, east, and west. The path of the sun goes around. You have the third dimension up and down known as the axis mundi. Now the upper world, above our plane of existence, which is here, the upper sky world is ruled by the Thunderbirds. The lower underworld is ruled by something known as the great horned serpent, or in some traditions, the underwater panther. It's a little bit of both. Okay, so this is the central key concept in sort of Native American and mound builder cosmology specifically. Now the Thunderbirds, one of the Algonquin sort of medicine societies known as the Midewiwin, considered the Thunderbird as the messenger to the spirit world. And according to the medicine man Lame Deer, there were always 4 Thunderbirds, just 4. The Thunderbirds lived in the 4 quarters. The Thunderbirds are the messenger of the 4 winds. While all things move in nature are said to move clockwise in Native American tradition, the Thunderbird is said to move counterclockwise. And as a representation of that, this is a Thunderbird whirl from the Pacific Northwest. And watch what happens when you spin it. For those that have seen aerial photographs of single crop circles, what does that look like? If I go back. How many people are familiar with the hourglass effect, the hourglass shape on the lay of crop circles? Very, very similar, right? You see that in there. The Thunderbird is what's known as an archetype for those that follow Carl Jung in his work, right? It appears around the world. It's like a universal archetype. So not only did the Native American cultures have it, but it had it around. Now, what is this connection between the Thunderbird and the serpent down below, the upper sky world and the Thunderbird down below? Well, the existence of the Thunderbird tradition among the Ojibwas, which lived in Wisconsin at this time, still today live in Wisconsin, was confirmed back in the late 1800s. And they considered that the thunder to be a god in the shape of a great eagle, which feeds upon the serpents. And it takes them from under the earth. That's the underworld, right? Now, this guy, Reverend Jones, that copied down that tradition, also relates the story of an Indian who visited the nest of a thunderbird on a high mountain, where he saw the bones of serpents kind of scattered around, and noticed that the bark of the young trees had been peeled off by the young thunderers trying their arrows before going abroad to hunt serpents. Remember what Art Rentella said in his very first reaction to just before the crop circle happened. He saw the bark coming off the tree, right? Keep that in mind. Now, the Ojibwas believe that the home of the Thunderbird from time to time sets forth in different parts of the earth to search for serpents. So the Thunderbird's out there during certain times of the year are looking for serpents. And when they saw a thunderbolt strike a tree, the Indians believed that the Thunderbird had shot its fiery arrows at the serpent, and that it was caught up in the twinkling of an eye. Now, this legend was ritually reenacted by various Native American tribes dating back a long history, and that this ritual was an earth renewal ceremony that they conducted each year. So upon the return of the Thunderbirds, they would do this earth renewal ceremony in sort of honor of this sort of tradition of the return of the Thunderbirds. Okay, now, just about, 8 weeks or so after that crop circle came down in Wisconsin, this crop circle came down in southern Ohio, right across the street, literally, across the street from Serpent Mound in southern Ohio. This crop circle was in soybeans, which is different than wheat, all right? It also happened and was found after a severe weather front had come through the area, knocked out power to 3 different power companies. So it sits down in a low valley alongside Brush Creek, and actually Serpent Mound sits on this ridge right up here. We found all kinds of physical anomalies and measured various EM changes and radiation changes, and so there's all kinds of stuff. If you want to read the report on this, go online to iccra.com. You can read all the details about it. But what's important about this in relationship to this talk is the Great Serpent Mound. For those that are not familiar with Serpent Mound, it's the largest effigy mound ever built, and it was built, it's really unknown. Some people pin it as far back as 5000 BC based on the fact that it seems to be laid out like the constellation Draco, the dragon. And the last time Draco was important to anybody was about 5,000 years ago, about the time that the pyramids were building it, because Alpha Draconis, the key star in the constellation Draco, was the North Celestial Pole, where Polaris is today, the key star in the sky in which all the other stars sort of rotate around in the northern hemisphere. Now, there have been archaic artifacts found at this site. Archaic times date back even farther than this, so this site may have been even older. But for whatever reason, this earthwork seems to be dated to, several thousand years ago at the minimum. Now, a couple of years ago, in preparation for a lecture I was doing for the Hanwakin Center, I put together a Lidar survey of Serpent Mound. Part of my background was in remote sensing, and so I got a set of remote sensing data from the Ohio Department of Transportation and created the most accurate map of Serpent Mound that's ever been created. And I'll just show you what all of the astronomical alignments are here. All of the yellow alignments are for solstices and equinox risings and settings. All of the blue ones are for lunar risings and settings, all of the key ones. And there's actually a Venus sunset alignment as well. The red line is just pointing out where north is to the rest of this. So this is a very sophisticated site, incredibly sophisticated to lay out all of these astronomical alignments in one design, in one site, and then make an art project out of it, right? It's a symbol. It's nothing more than sheer genius, really, to be honest. If you go to like Stonehenge, Stonehenge doesn't have all these astronomical alignments. It has a few, but it's, you stand behind one stone and you look at another stone and there's the rising and setting. This is incorporated within the bends of the serpent and the coil itself. So to lay all of that out is pretty sophisticated stuff, particularly for a couple thousand years ago. All right. Now, what was the relationship between the crop circle and Serpent Mound? Well, it turns out that it was aligned right through the head of the serpent. So symbolically, if you think about that, the formation literally reenacts the ritual of shooting the arrow through the head of the serpent, right? The Thunderbird shooting the arrow through the head of the serpent to kill it. This is the renewal ceremony. This is what we are seeing taking place. it is ritually being reenacted in this relationship between the crop circles and the earthworks. Now, the reason that I started going down this path of understanding and trying to understand the context of where crop circles are occurring has had to do with these earthworks. Remember what I said about paradigms. The rules haven't been written yet, right, for studying crop circles. We were using very, very sort of limited understanding of taking certain scientific disciplines and studying crop circles and determining whether one's man-made or not. But that only gets you so far, right? You can't really get to a source cause or an understanding of what is creating crop circles from only looking at the trace evidence. And so what we decided to do was to look at other methods of thought, right? The Native Americans had their own sort of couple of thousand years of understanding the world in their own way, which can be described as being equally valid. They just look at the world in a different way, and they describe it in different terms than we're used to. But what they're telling us is giving us insight into understanding crop circles on a completely different level than just looking at it from a scientific perspective, right? And so that's why we've sort of taken this sort of avenue of investigation, because this is leading us to new insight. These alignments of earthworks and mounds, there is something significant about it. So going back to Mayville Kokoski, in my sort of hunt for where are the earthworks nearby, I came across a map that was done back in the first map of this was done in the 1840s by a guy by the name of I.A. Lapham. And I took that map and I incorporated it into Google Earth and mapped it very accurately. Now, the map back then wasn't quite as accurate, so this only gives us a general idea of where the earthworks were in this area. But literally, right to the south of where Mayville's crop circle occurred, the closest mound was known as the Mayville Serpent Mound. No longer exists. It's been obliterated. But it was written about several times. So again, we have this sort of relationship between a serpent mound and a crop circle nearby. Now remember, the star being, or sort of petriform, the herald of the Thunderbirds, was nearby here. It was to the west. Now, which way do the normal weather patterns go? West? Yeah, west to east, right? So to be the harbinger, to be the herald of the Thunderbirds, you had to be west of this place, which is exactly where the star being was in the landscape. So there's some really interesting stuff going on here. Now, keep that in mind, but kind of set it aside for a moment, because we're going to kind of take a little bit of detour. It was through this idea of mapping out the relationship between the Native American earthworks and where the crop circles have occurred that I started seeing additional sort of connections between crop circles that are really interesting and most people are generally unaware of. It was strictly only because the technology has advanced enough for us to be able to very accurately map where crop circles are located. We have taken some aerial mapping photos of crop circles, so we get them mapped very accurately in these sort of GIS programs, and we have found some stunning stuff. And so let's take a look at that. Here is where the crop circle occurred near Serpent Mound, right here in Adams County. In 2003, there were 4 crop circles that came down in essentially a straight line over a 68-mile distance. Hilltop, Kentucky in May of 2003. Then in August, the Serpent Mound crop circle, or near Locust Grove. And then Bainbridge in September. And then here in West Union in October. sort of a line across the landscape. That's pretty interesting stuff. The following year, in 2004, across the same area, across the whole state of Ohio and extending into West Virginia, there were 5 crop circles in a straight line. And they went all the way here. This is 239 miles, all in a straight line. And it turns out that the ICCRA actually did some test crop circles. We made some of our own so that we could test the response of the plants and document, how the plants, were coming back up and things like that. And that actually fell on the line. How ironic is that? In 2005, we got word of a couple of crop circles in North Carolina, in western North Carolina. And literally, as I was driving down to North Carolina, I got a call from a friend of mine, Andreas Muller, a crop circle researcher from Germany, who said, hey, I got a report of a crop circle in West Virginia. That same crop circle from 2004. He just heard about it. Well, it turns out that the couple that we heard about, we put them on the map, and we looked on the map, and we drew a line on the map and said, oh boy, here we go again. We are seeing another line. So this time, we got in a plane, and using GPS, we flew that line and found 2 more crop circles that had not been reported. So we used this as methodology to help us find additional crop circles. So some interesting stuff going on there. All right, so there's the 3 lines from 2003 to 2005. You had 03 here, 04 here, 05 here. All right, so we're seeing this. It turns out that I actually identified one of these lines back in 1996. There were 3 crop circles that came down in Indiana, near Fort Wayne, only over an 8.5-mile distance. And we're talking about light years beyond 8.5 miles, right? And this year, for any of those that are interested, that area near Fort Wayne is where we're going to hold our crop circle conference this year in about a month. And there were actually about a half a dozen crop circles within 8 miles that took place, and we're going to go there, and there's all kinds of Native American stuff there. And so if anybody's that interested, feel free to come to our conference. Now, one of the crop circles in 2004 that fell on that line was this crop circle here that happened near Miamisburg, Ohio in August. And this was in corn taller than you, all right? And you can see the people down there, so this is a pretty big formation. It was reported by a local sheriff's department who saw it in a traffic copter. You could not see it from any vantage point on the ground, no road driving by or anything like that. It was way, way back in a cornfield. It was lucky that the sheriff drove by. They contacted me. I came out there to take a look at it with our team. Ted Robertson and I were actually in the formation when some unusual sounds were taking place, which we recorded. We measured this to be L-neat positive for node elongation. There were all kinds of anomalies here. People saw unusual lights, videotaped some unusual lights in this formation, a lot of stuff. But interestingly enough, it has a very similar design to the Serpent Mound formation. Basically, all of the same component parts just moved around a little. And you can actually overlay one over the top of the other, and you can see that, how similar they are. Ted Robertson, one of the ICCRA members, found that it has this repeating fractal pattern that actually makes up the design itself. So crop circles are iterable. You see them sort of repeat on a theme in some cases, which is kind of interesting. Now this formation here, again, you can see Google. There's a formation down here. That's our overlay. It was perfectly aligned right to that Miamisburg mound, which I showed you a photo of before. Okay, so literally in the last field left closest to it, they put in all kinds of subdivisions around that mound now. The last field closest to it was where the crop circle took place. And now this field is now under construction. They're building a school there, so you'll never see that again in that field. Now, if you go out to Google Earth, here's the formation. I've sort of put in an overlay just so you can see what the formation is. But actually, in Google, you can see the remnants of this formation. It was harvested, and the satellite photography was taken the following spring, where you could still see the remnant of the formation. And I noticed something interesting about it. This red line is the center point of basically all of these circles lined up, except for this circle way out at the end. The circle way out at the end was like offset. And we couldn't really figure out why until I mapped it. And it turns out that if you draw a line from the tip of that formation through that offset circle and just continue it, you end up drawing a line across Ohio, across the landscape, to one of the circles in the 2003 line. And it actually is right to the center of it. So we have an instance where you have a crop circle more than 60 miles away that is referencing another crop circle. It is aligned to it. So that's pretty amazing stuff. Here's where the 2003 line came in. Here's that alignment from the Miamisburg formation. So let's take a look at this formation, because I didn't talk about it earlier. This is the one that appeared near Bainbridge, which I mentioned very, very early on. This is probably one of the most sophisticated crop circles that has ever come down in the United States or in the world, period. For those that are familiar with the crop circle researcher Bert Janssen, we sent him the sort of schematics of this formation, all the measurements, and he wrote about this in his most recent book. If you go out and find his book online, The Hypnotic Power of Crop Circles, he devotes a chapter to his most favorite formations that he's ever looked at. He didn't come and investigate this formation on the ground. He only got what we sent him. But it turned out that he's a geometer, and he studies the geometry of crop circles, and he said for the last 15 years that he's been studying crop circle geometry, he learned certain geometric lessons along the way. This crop circle incorporated every single geometric lesson that he ever learned from crop circles in one design. It's amazing, his design. So his schematic of it. So this is about almost 300 feet across. It happened in soybeans. It happened on an island in a river. And it we found all kinds of interesting sort of plant anomalies, same as we found in some of these other ones. And I even had a GPS actually burn out right in my hand. It literally began to glow and then just fried the electronics right out, which is a sort of a hard lesson to learn. I've actually had 2 of those burn out in various formations. It's sort of the cost of doing business when you're investigating crop circles. Now, here's what it looked like on the ground. There's the island down here. This is a nice aerial photo courtesy of Chris Steele, another ICCRA member. There's the river, sort of an oxbow in the river. The river splits and goes around both sides. Couldn't see it from any road. It was found by the pilot that actually flew me over the Serpent Mound crop circle to take photos of it. He later saw this one about a month or so later. And I was the first one out into this formation. And along with Doug McElwain, you can see Doug McElwain standing there. We're looking at one of the circles, the southernmost circle, and here you can see standing water. There was literally standing water about almost up to your knee as you're walking through that third of the formation. So very, very difficult to navigate through. No tracks leading in, no tracks leading out, that kind of stuff. So very interesting formation, again, in soybeans. Now, I put this together to show some of the geometry here that is not really apparent to the naked eye, but that the sort of elements of this formation are what I call harmonically balanced. They interact with one another, and you'll see this in this animation as it plays. You have various sort of sizes that fix the placement of where this design actually occurs. So you see this all sort of incorporated into one design. It's almost like throwing some pebbles in a lake and seeing the ripples go on. It's pretty sophisticated design, even though it looks very simple. Now, if you took each element of this formation, the triangle, the circle with a ring around it, and the little symbol, kind of crazy-looking symbol down in the bottom. It turns out that each one of these, the Native Americans have denoted these symbols before. The earliest documentation of a symbol of a circle with a ring around it with a curved arm, exactly this symbol right here, was found on birch bark scrolls possessed by the Midween, the Grand Medicine Society of the Ojibwa. And it was translated to mean, back in 1885, that which I live upon has been put on this dish by the Spirit. Now, the triangle goes back as far as 1634. The French explorer Lejeune was told by another Ojibwa medicine society known as the Jessiquid that triangles were the symbols of air spirits and an indicator of the source of life. Now, this symbol we've clearly found this identified in many, many petroglyphs as a Thunderbird symbol. The earliest known was by Garrick Mallory in 1888, and it's clearly a Thunderbird symbol. So we have this written all over it. If you use the tools given to us by Native Americans to understand this, they're telling you what this is, right? All of these things are referencing air spirits, Thunderbird, right? The great spirits. Now this crop circle, there's the island right there. It came down in this valley known as the Paint Creek Valley. This is the Paint Creek. It's the largest sort of creek in the United States. It's not labeled a river. And right nearby was this gigantic complex of earthworks known as the Serpent Mound Earthworks. Remember, this is 300 feet across or so. This crop circle formation is just dwarfed by the size of that earthwork that formerly existed, only parts of which are still there. It turns out that back in 2000 in this valley, there was also a crop circle that occurred right here. And actually, all through this area, there were other earthworks that are now obliterated. They're all gone. And if you go up this road, US Route 50, and this way, either direction, for tens of miles, there are huge earthwork complexes just like this that appear about once every 2 miles. And these were all built at least 2,000 years ago. So this whole area is just absolutely filled with it. Now, you remember that triangle portion of it? That triangle points exactly to the central feature of the mound, in the center of that complex of earthworks. So this was an artifact that was found during the excavation of this central mound. You can see that this also has some geometry to it. Again, built by the Hopewell around 100 AD or so, and it was built using standard units of measure. What's interesting about this mound is that there were artifacts found in this mound from Tennessee, Wyoming, North Carolina, Michigan, and more. So there was wide trading networks all across the United States for this. Now, this is a sort of three-dimensional model of Serpent Mound, which appears in the museum, the Ohio Historical Society Museum in Columbus, Ohio. And so you can see these earthworks here. What's interesting about it is this has this sort of repeated geometry inside it, very similar to the repeated geometry that we saw in that crop circle formation. And there are all these additional mounds that have all these alignments to it. Now, remember the cosmology slide that I showed you with the 3 levels. There's our plane of existence, there's the upper sky world, and the lower underworld, right? What's interesting about this earthwork is that there are 3 levels to it. It was clearly built on 3 separate levels. And the level in the center where this square, which is representative of this square, and the circle bisect each other, that square goes right through the central portion of that mound. The square, in a number of Native American myths, refers to the snake man. The circle refers to the Thunderbird. So this is the congregation of the place on Earth where you can go and interact with both of those planes of existence. And it turns out, when this mound was excavated, there originally was a building there. And it was in 2 parts, separated by a little hallway. 2 separate parts, and this square bisects that completely. And the various artifacts found in those areas appear to be related to either the Thunderbird or the Serpent. And so this is a place that was ritually used to connect. And so we have this crop circle that seems to have this repeated information encoded in it. So here we are. This is an aerial mapping photograph that is courtesy of Chris Steele. We have the triangle that points to Serpent Mound. Here's the alignment of the 2003 formation. So this little portion here of this is the same as this line. This portion here is the same as this line, but where does that go? Right? Where does that go? This is what got us really, really interested in the last 2 years, was finding this right here. Now, I want to show you this. I'm going to leave my presentation momentarily. I'm going to bring up a little movie that I made of this so you can see this in Google Earth. Here's the formation with the line, right? And as I play that, we'll zoom out and we'll see that line extended across the landscape. It turns out that that formation, that little avenue, that straight line avenue, points all the way to the very first crop circle that I ever investigated in Ohio back in 1996. It points right to the center of this single circle in a place called Paulding, Ohio. Now, once I discovered this, I started looking at every single crop circle formation that we were able to map across the United States. And it turns out that every single non-man-made crop circle that has some straight line geometry to it, that straight line points across the landscape to another crop circle formation here in the United States. And in many cases, it'll either go right to the center or it'll go right into another straight line pathway and connect. So this is pretty sophisticated stuff. And we could only do this thanks to the technology that has come about. Because Google Earth wasn't available 10 years ago, right? We never would have been able to figure it out using paper maps. It would have been way, way too hard to do. So Bainbridge De Paulding was the first recorded incident of a specific geometric feature in a crop circle formation aligning to another crop circle, 145 miles. Now, Paulding was from 1996. Bainbridge was 2003, so it's referencing a crop circle in the past. What we have found is that some crop circles, in going back and mapping them, have referenced crop circles that are to take place in the future. So some of the crop circles that are aligned point to crop circles that haven't taken place yet. So we are tentatively using this as a diagnostic tool to maybe help us understand maybe where crop circles are going to occur. It's kind of like looking at a needle in a haystack because the U.S. is a big place, right? So, and the other piece of that that's important is, while we've used this database and mapped all of this information, we haven't released it to everybody because we're kind of walking a tightrope as to not allowing it to get out so that people can do malicious things, right? And screw up the data. So at this point, we have a clean set of data, and we have a lot less hoaxing here in the United States. Hopefully that stays that way. And so hopefully we can find more things like this in the future. So Miami to Bainbridge was that sort of alignment offset, and that was only 60 miles. Now, I'll give you just a few notable ones. I won't show all these because we don't have time to go through them all. But West Union had 3 straight line components to it. Each one of those straight line components went to a different crop circle. Kleiman, Wisconsin, in August of 2003, had 4 different alignments to 4 different crop circles. Huntingburg from Indiana, June 2006, had 8. Madisonville, Tennessee, from May 2007, had 9. 9 different crop circles pointing out from the straight line pathways. So let's take a look at Madisonville. Well, before I get there, let's just say one quick thing. Let me check my time. Okay, we're almost done, right? We'll go through this pretty quick. This is Madisonville, Tennessee. Oh, I still have not. Oh, good. We have plenty of time to look at this carefully. Madisonville, Tennessee. We'll go back that one slide. The nature of these observations of alignments and straight line pathways brings up a couple of questions. One is, were all the crop circles planned out in advance? And have they been slowly unfolding over time? That's a possibility, right? Or do crop circles appear at like nodal points of some kind of geometric grid of energy? A lot of people talk about ley lines and, earth energy grids and things like that. So we have that possibility. But there could be additional forces acting upon where and when crop circles occur that we don't yet know about, right? We didn't know any of this information until just the last couple of years. People have been looking at crop circles for, since 1980 is the modern era start of looking at crop circles with Dr. Terence Meaden in England. Nobody has seen anything like this. Nobody's uncovered this because the technology hadn't gotten us to the point where we could recognize it. Now that we've recognized it, what do we not yet know that we don't have the technological capability of understanding yet? That's part of what we need to think about, right? Again, going back to that idea of the paradigm, the rules haven't been written yet. We now have found a few more rules. We've found a few more things to think about when we look at crop circles. So let's look carefully at Madisonville, Tennessee. Madisonville was in wheat, and it had all kinds of straight line components to it. All of these extend out to yet a different crop circle, except these two green ones, they actually point to mounds nearby. And even the triangle in the center, which was kind of weirdly offset for some reason, we didn't really understand why, that triangle, each one of those parts of the triangle actually point to a different crop circle formation. So when you look at this, and by the way, I drew another red line that goes to the center of it. This crop circle was actually referenced by a different crop circle in Montana from 2001, pointed all the way back over 1,800 miles, right to the center of this crop circle, which happened 6 years later. All right, so here's the map, Madisonville, Tennessee down here. All of these point to different crop circles in the landscape. The farthest one goes all the way to Solano County, California, to a crop circle near Fairfield. That's pretty far across the United States. What I haven't yet done is map all of the crop circles up in Canada. I've started mapping the Ontario crop circles, but I haven't gotten the rest of it done. I'm working with getting the information with Joanna Emery in Ontario, and Paul Anderson, who's in charge of the CCRN network up in British Columbia, and actually he's the director for the Canadian Crop Circle Group all across Canada. And there have been very few crop circles mapped from Mexico. We've gotten a few through Ruben Yarte, for those that know Ruben. Ruben, Spanish, he is good at Spanish, he's got Spanish language capability, and he has Spanish language contacts, and they've reported crop circles to Ruben for us, and we've helped with some investigations down in Mexico. So North America, we're cooperating. We're trying to, get together and cooperate with one another. That's something that we've tried to avoid, the kind of pitfalls that have happened in the UK. There's a lot of infighting going on, stuff like that. That's really not happened here in the United States to any great extent. So everybody seems to be getting together to pool that information, to share that information so that we can make bigger, broader discoveries like this. I never would have been able to do this had it not been for a whole vast army of other people who went out and investigated crop circles over 15, 20 years and helped pool that information and collectively put it together. So, the ICCRA is very helpful in getting everybody together to do these kinds of things. So here's Madisonville, Tennessee. This double Celtic cross that was overlapped is the Celtic cross portion of it. was labeled as such over in England because they had a whole bunch of these kinds of crop circles over in England over about a 15-year period of time. We've had a few here in the United States, I'd say about 5 or 6 out of the 600 plus that have been reported here in the United States. Only about 5 or 6 have been Celtic cross designs. We did find increased radioactivity in this formation, increased electromagnetic fields. We measured it for node elongation. It was positive for that. There were no tram lines in this field, no access to go up and down to get to this formation. This pathway was made by the first person that went out to look at it, right here, that little running person that go out there. It was actually Mark Boring from the Monroe County Buzz who actually ended up taking this photograph. He's the one that walked out there. It's located in an area of all kinds of Native American sites. It's actually the ancestral homeland of the Cherokee. There are all kinds of mound sites and ancient village sites in this area. And here's the map. Here's Madisonville, Tennessee, right here. Do you see this lake? This big dammed up lake, courtesy of the Tennessee Valley Authority, literally flooded the ancestral homeland of the Cherokee and destroyed dozens and dozens of mound sites and ancient village sites. They're all underwater. One of the closest, though, that still is on land, the closest one really to Madisonville, Tennessee, is this one called Ice House Bottom. Now, Ice House Bottom is really interesting because in the excavations of Ice House Bottom, they found artifacts, pottery shards that came from Serpent Mound. And when they excavated Serpent Mound, they found pottery shards that came from Ice House Bottom. It's the first identifiable site of this trading network back and forth of the ancient peoples of the Hopewell during that era. So they're sharing that same cosmology. They're sharing those ideas. They're sharing the same stuff. It turns out that Ice House Bottom is one of the oldest Native American habitation sites in the United States. Dates back at least 9,500 years. So this is very, very ancient stuff. And they also found pottery shards from the Liberty Earthworks, which is about 15 miles east of Serpent Mound. Very similar design. Again, the square-circle combination had a very large central mound right here, which had the exact same building design that ended up being covered over by a mound. 2 sort of rooms connected by a hallway, a causeway. So same exact kinds of things. Now, I went back in some of the archives and found an old video footage that the TVA did before they flooded the valley. And this is one of the mounds at Toqua, which is nearby to Madisonville. The Big Toco Mound is very similar to Serpent Mound in its construction. And one of the artifacts that they found in the Big Toco Mound when it was excavated in the late 1800s is this Celtic cross pattern. So this is from the annual report of the Smithsonian. They basically, for those that don't know, around the late 1800s had a systematic program of going around and basically bulldozing earthwork sites across the United States. They were doing upwards of 20 a day, 20 earthwork sites a day. Within a very, very short time frame, within 5 years, they demolished more than 10,000 Indian mound sites in the eastern half of the United States, and just basically took all the artifacts, shipped them back to the Smithsonian, and you know, if you're familiar with Raiders of the Lost Ark at the end, where they're just wheeling the box into a vast warehouse, that's basically what happened to all these artifacts. Most of them never to be seen again. So this seems to be this repeating pattern. These crop circles are referencing the same symbols and the same kinds of information that we see at the earthwork sites that happen nearby where these crop circles come down. Now here's some additional artifacts that are similar to that. Here's a shell artifact that shows that Celtic cross pattern. There are literally dozens of these that have been found. I took a photograph of this one from southern Indiana at a museum called Angel Mounds. This one is actually Hopewell. This came out of a mound, actually the Hopewell site which is about 15 miles from Serpent Mound in southern Ohio, up the Paint Creek Valley. And you can see that this actually shows essentially the double Celtic cross pattern. You can see that there's one here and then another one here. And this shell gorget came from a site called Wycliffe, Kentucky, which I happened to visit on my way here, driving over here. They actually have the bird head symbol creating the second Celtic cross. Again, the Thunderbird related to the Celtic cross pattern. Now, to give you some kind of context, a better way of putting this, I'm going to give you a couple of quotes by a guy by the name of Ervin Laszlo. Anybody know Ervin Laszlo? A few people? He's written several books. One of his most recent books is this one called Quantum Shift in the Global Brain: How the New Scientific Reality Can Change Us and Our World. And he says, our map of the world is changing. Science itself is in the midst of a paradigm shift. The new paradigm gives us a deeper understanding of the nature of quantum shifts in complex systems in nature as well as society. Now, the connection between a shift in consciousness and a shift in civilization was envisaged by the Native American cultures, including the Maya, the Cherokee, the Hopi, the Inca, the Seneca, etc. It goes on and on. They indicate that we are presently living under a fifth sun of consciousness and are on the verge of entering the sixth sun. This sixth sun will bring a new consciousness and with it a fundamental transformation of civilization. Now, his quote is, the key insight coming from the new paradigm in the sciences is not technological. It is the confirmation of something people have always felt but could not give a rational explanation for: our close connection to each other and to the cosmos. Traditional people have known of it and have lived it, but modern civilization has first neglected it, and then denied it. This is vitally important, for admitting the intuition of connections to our everyday consciousness can inspire the solidarity we so urgently need to live on in this planet. Now, if you think about what he's saying, and you think about what I've just shown you, the Native Americans built a whole system of earthworks more than 2,000 years ago, and built that upon a cosmology of understanding the world different from Western civilization's understanding of the world. And you have to sort of put yourself out of our modern society to understand, why did they build these earthworks in the places that they did? Many of these earthworks exist in places that have electromagnetic field changes to them. And people can feel that. Dowsers feel that, but you can actually go with detectors and actually measure that. John Burke, a crop circle researcher who recently died last month, I think, or maybe about 6 weeks ago, wrote a book recently called The Seed of Knowledge, Stone of Plenty. Burke went to various ancient sites, including Serpent Mound, Stonehenge, and a number of places, and he took wheat seeds with him, and he placed them in these places. And after he left them there for a period of time, then took them back to his lab to germinate them, compared to controls that he had, they grew faster and more vibrant than normal seeds did, which is exactly the same findings that Burke and Levengood discovered when Burke and W.C. Levengood, the biophysicist, did their early crop circle research. And so Burke identified clearly that there is the same sort of electromagnetic field stuff taking place at earthwork sites that is taking place at crop circle sites. And they're adjacent to one another. There is this idea that the Native Americans knew a little bit more about what's going on with how things work than what modern science really understands today. And we're seeing evidence of that come back up over and over and over again. So let me leave you with one last quote. from a Native American elder, Distant Eagle, who talks about the thunder beings. He says that they are the guardians of truth. Remember this: when the wind and the rain lash your face, when you see a flash of lightning, when you hear the voice of thunder, when your home is shaking, they are there. When they are there, shut up and listen to them. But even when you don't observe these manifestations of their presence, bear in mind that they are never far from us and can hear us, even our thoughts, especially where they are silent themselves. So be truthful, be good, be generous, be humble, be respectful. Nobody carries thunder being medicine. Never claim any connection with them, as they do not take kindly to that and are never to be trifled with. When you are sure they are there, they're not. When you are sure they aren't there, they come full force. They are beyond good and evil. They are cleansers. They cleanse away everything, good and evil. That is to say, they lead to new beginnings. So the question is, what are crop circles? Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions in whatever time we have left. Don't have a microphone yet, okay.
I'll just ask a question first, and then if you don't mind repeating it, we'll set the
Sure.
With the lines that you've drawn on the maps, have there been any correlations with angles between the intersecting lines over the years?
Well, that's a good question. The question is, are there any correlations with angles with the lines that we found in the intersections of these sort of alignment lines? Yes, if you carefully look at the 2004 line from Ohio to West Virginia connecting to the 2005 line of North Carolina to West Virginia, that's a 90-degree angle. Okay. The alignment from the crop circle that appeared near Miamisburg, the offset line down to Bainbridge, to the 2003 line, that's also a 90-degree angle. So there is some sort of significant geometry to that. How much that plays into what's going on, we haven't really gone down that road to investigate that piece of it yet.
The reason why I asked that is I noticed that, and any possibility, is that an indication of the serpent, the box?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer for you.
Okay, thank you.
Jeff, I was wondering what you thought of the origin of the mound builders, and I don't know if you've read any of Gregory Little's stuff, and Edgar Casey, and okay. Is that
Need to heat the mic up? Yep.
okay? Did you hear the question, Jeff? I was wondering if you have an opinion on the origin of the mound builders. And of course, to me, it seems like a lot of the pyramidal structures and a lot of their artifacts are Toltec and come from central Mexico. Edgar Casey contended that, Greg Little contended that, but conventional archaeology does not.
Okay. I think you have to understand, so far what archaeology has discovered is strictly from excavations, right? They're very literal in what they look at, and they only report their tangible findings. And since they're only looking at excavations of burial stuff, they really don't understand a whole lot about the nature of some of these ancient cultures. There is a whole series of mound-building cultures in the United States, the earliest of which are the Adena in Ohio, which date back to about 1000 BC. They overlap with the Hopewell in Ohio, which start about 500 AD and run to about 500 BC to about 500 AD. Then there's a big gap in mound-building culture for 600-700 years until the Mississippian culture, of which you're sort of referencing with big pyramidal structures, they don't come around until about 1000 AD, 1100 AD. And we, as yet, have not found any direct connection with crop circles and the Mississippian mound-building culture. It's really with more ancient cultures, earlier mound building stuff that we found a connection to. That's not to say that it won't happen with Mississippian earthwork sites. We just haven't found any evidence of that yet. So what the origin of the mound builders are, there's several origins, right? There are different cultures that have lived here that have built mounds. And which one, I'm not a reader of Edgar Cayce, so I can't really reference what he's talking about. And I haven't read Greg Little either. So.
The earliest mounds, though, are like 3,500 BC down in Louisiana, Watson Breaks, and
That is the very earliest ones in North America are Watson Break in Louisiana, yeah.
I would contend that further confirmation that they came up from the south. Casey said they left and went back to Mexico and then came back, and that's the reason for the break.
Right. The only real evidence for a connection with, let's say, the Maya in Mexico, which were contemporary with the Hopewell, that'd be, Maya came before the Aztecs, is a place in Florida known as Crystal River. Anybody been to Crystal River, Florida? It's kind of where the manatees congregate on the Gulf Coast side, not too far from Orlando. It's a sort of large mound builder complex, in which they built all of their mounds out of shells. And they have several pyramidal platform mounds there. At that site, one of the things that they found was that there were a whole series of stela, sort of carved pillars, that had sort of animal designs on them. And the only other place that's ever been found is that the Maya did the same thing. So if you really think about it, it's not that far of a trek to go around the Gulf of Mexico from the Yucatan over to Florida. So the trading network may have existed there. Now the connection with the Hopewell is that at Crystal River, they found a number of artifacts that were Hopewell. So the trading network that the Hopewell mound builders were doing does extend to Crystal River about 2,000 years ago, and that's contemporary with Maya culture. So there may be that connection. And there are several sort of Native American traditions that say that, or at least a branch say that they may have migrated upwards, but it's hard to pin that down. The evidence for that is very tenuous. We try to be very evidence-based, and that's kind of what I try to reflect. Yeah.
Jeff, I want to thank you for all of your hard work and an excellent presentation, very informative.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I want to thank you for publicizing Erwin Laszlo's book. What is it? Quantum Shift and the Global Brain. Highly recommended. Also very informative.
Yeah, I would recommend it too.
And I want to ask you to not think too poorly of the Smithsonian Institute for the Excavations of the Earth Mounds. I have a strong hunch there is a museum of Earth history that a lot of the people in this room will probably get to see someday, but I suspect it's underground.
We can only hope, right?
There are crop circles all over the world, and they are found where there have been no earth mounds. So my question is to you, what is the source of the energy that is making these crop circles everywhere?
That's an excellent question. Very few places around the world don't have ancient archaeological sites. Mound building actually has a tradition in many places around the world. There are mounds that were in Japan that are contemporary with the Hopewell. The Chinese built ancient giant pyramids. You can keep going across the continent. There are mounds throughout Europe. Wherever you see crop circles, like in Germany or Austria or Poland, there are all kinds of earthwork cultures that existed through there. In England, of course, there are mound building cultures all over the place there, as well as stone sites and building cultures. Even, you can literally go around the world and find that kind of connection. Now, what is the energy that is creating them? That's a separate question. And just to give you sort of a hypothesis, what I would suggest is that over the last 20 years, there have been very few actual real hypotheses about what is creating crop circles based on the evidence that people are finding. The only real significant hypothesis that was developed was by Dr. Terence Meaden in England in the early 1980s, whereas he was looking at a whole series of single circle crop circles, and he thought that it had to do with some kind of weather effect. And it was a swirling or a vortex. He later modified that as more information came in and modified his hypothesis to say it was an energy vortex. Some sort of glimmers of idea about what could be the source of that came from W.C. Levengood, who hypothesized that energy vortex, or that information, was an electrical plasma that could have come down from the upper atmosphere. But nobody has sort of linked the correlations that I've done. And one of the things that you have to think about with power lines and the water source nearby and the downslope of a hill has to do with sort of the charge imbalance in the ground. This is sort of the physics background coming out. You can literally go out and measure the electrical field at the top of a hill, or the magnetic field at the top of a hill, go to the bottom of that hill and measure it again with sensitive instruments, and you'll see a change. You'll also see a change by measuring the electrical field in an area of flowing water or running water, because it strips ions away from what that water is flowing to, so you get sort of a negative charge in that. When you have power lines running by, you have a tremendous positive electrical charge kind of going through those power lines. And so what you have is an area in which you have several things that create a charge imbalance in the landscape. And I think all it takes is like a trigger mechanism to kind of go by like a storm front, which carries an electrical charge with it, that can cause a cascade of electrical energy in this little system that you've built. And you can create an electrical charge in that area. Now, why the geometry? That's a very, very difficult question to answer, and nobody has an answer for that. One of the things that we've taken a look at recently, back in 2005, I got a call from the National Weather Service. For those that are unaware of, part of the National Weather Service's job is to go out and look at damaged debris fields from tornadoes. And they look at the evidence left behind, and they do some physics and calculate what sort of energy was associated with that tornado, and they'll classify it as an F1 or an F2 or an F3 on the Fujita scale, the intensity of that tornado. And so they're very used to looking at damage fields. One of the things that they found was some damage that they'd never seen before, and it looked like crop circles to them, so they called me, and they said, "Can you help us with this?" And I took that opportunity to say, "Okay, please get me the data from the National Lightning Detection Network Array." For those that don't know, your tax money, hard at work, has built an array of sensors across the United States that detect every time a lightning strikes, it pinpoints exactly where that lightning bolt hit. And it'll tell you the polarity of it, positive or negative. It turns out that overwhelmingly, the vast majority of electrical strikes are negatively charged. But during a 15-minute time frame of where this crop circle occurred in upstate New York, there were a whole series of positively charged electrical strikes that they recorded on the National Lightning Detection Network Array that they had no idea how to explain. So we may have a clue as to how that electrical energy may be generated in association with some storm fronts, that it's positive in nature, it's a positively charged electrical vortex perhaps. We just don't have all the pieces yet. The evidence isn't there. We have to keep working and keep digging to collect the evidence to understand what that energy signature is. And that only tells us, sort of, based on looking at the trace evidence, what that energy might be, but that still doesn't tell us what the source cause of it is, right? We only can say, sort of in a general sense, it's associated with storm fronts, but not all the time. And so it may be that crop circles there's more than one cause for crop circles. We don't have all the answers. So at this point, what I always tell everybody when they ask me that question, because that's the million-dollar question, what's making crop circles, is that no one has enough evidence to tell you that question, the answer to that question. No one has collected enough evidence to support any one hypothesis. People have some bits and pieces, but at this point, any hypothesis as to what's making crop circles is as equally valid as any other one because nobody has enough evidence. And so that's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's generally the state of knowledge at this point.
And Jeff, I noticed two things. One, you didn't address limestone. The UK island is a limestone maybe the whole thing is limestone. And so could a crystalline nature contribute to what happens there? And would these areas on your map, those red lines, my second part of the question is limestone, why isn't it on that map? And the second thing is, where the lines went out that you followed, they seem to all come to Miamisburg. What role do you think Miamisburg would have played past and now maybe present?
Those are very good questions, Linda. What I say, I didn't put the limestone piece in there, but it is a key piece. I didn't have time. I usually talk about all the science, and I didn't in this talk, but the limestone aspect of it was discovered by Glenn Broughton, a crop circle researcher that some people may know. He and another gentleman, that his name escapes me at this point, I can't remember, mapped all of the crop circles that had happened in England over a 5-year period up to about 1995, from 1990 to 1995. And what they found was that they fell along an area where there was kind of a limestone base underneath the soil. And it's very unclear as to why that would be the case, but we do see a very similar thing here in the United States. Many crop circles appear over the top of limestone aquifers, and I think it actually has more to do with the water aspect of it than with the crystalline aspect of it. Because as aquifers go up and down through the limestone, it actually strips ions out away from it, and it creates a different kind of a charge in the landscape. And that's, I think, part of that sort of building up of the charge imbalance in the landscape. And I'm not sure that it has anything to do with the crystalline nature of limestone specifically, because they also find it in greensand. Greensand in England, that was the other area where they found it, and that's really not limestone. It's a different kind of an aquifer, but another aquifer nonetheless. I think it has more to do with the water than the other ones. Now, your other question about Miamisburg, for those that want to read about Miamisburg, we have about, I've put up on our website probably about 30 PowerPoint slides about Miamisburg that goes into quite a bit of detail about it. One interesting aspect that Linda referenced that we've talked about in the past is that in 2004, there were 4 major Category 5 hurricanes that took place and hit the coast of the United States. When you look at the actual storm track of those hurricanes, those storm track, when it hit the coast of the United States, if you drew a line from where that storm track was going, you can follow a path where all 4 of those converged right over Miamisburg. Now, remember what I said about there may be a possibility that we're seeing some sort of energy grid. Hurricanes are pumping tremendous amounts of energy into the Earth's system, right? They're generating, these huge vortexes are changing the magnetic fields and pumping energy into the atmosphere. And it could be that there is an underlying sort of geometric grid in which all of these are sort of following, and that sort of energy makes its way and is part of the trigger mechanism. We don't really know for sure. One of the remnants of that hurricane actually made it all the way to Miamisburg that year. It was very unusual, but the hurricane remnants made it all the way to Miamisburg, Ohio. So, and right at the time that that crop circle occurred in August. So, we just don't have all the answers, but there's all these sort of intriguing puzzle pieces that we're still piecing together. And I literally could go on for a couple of days to talk about all these different things, but we hold a conference for that, and and you can come to ours for that or whatever. So,
is there any evidence of unseen parties, highly capable parties, perhaps in a stealthy mode, surveilling these crop circles? Is there evidence of aircraft, unidentified aircraft, large LINT, SIGINT, of any sort, by any parties doing, picking up, looking, doing scanning in these areas? What I'm suggesting is black ops. Is there some government branch or bureau that possibly is doing surveillance of the? And I might suggest also is, have you looked into the underground aspect of this whole picture in terms of plate tectonics and deeper possible patterns?
I'll answer your first question is a good one, and I know we talked about this before I came up here. The very first crop circle that we talked about, the one that was eyewitnessed, please go out and read our report about that because it talks about that aspect. While we were at that crop circle in Mayville, Wisconsin, the military showed up. And that's the first instance in the United States, really, that the military arrived. And they came in a helicopter right over the top of the crop circle, flew away after a few minutes of photographing it. We have photographs of that in that report. I may have photographed a sequence of photos of the helicopter in which it shows a sort of a luminous ball of light in front of the helicopter and moving around it. The other three people I was with also took photographs of the helicopter but didn't get the photo of the ball of light. I was the only one that had a polarizing lens on my camera, and that may have helped to be able to see that luminous ball of light, whereas everybody else didn't get that. The helicopter flew away. About 15 minutes later, again, flew back over it. And then about a half an hour later, while we were in the crop circle, there was a soldier that came in uniform to the site, copied down our license plate numbers, went into the crop circle. We talked with him for about 20 minutes. Basically told us a number of unverifiable things, but essentially said that there was a unit of the military that was operating out of Scott Air Force Base in Illinois that was assigned to go around and look at crop circles, and that this was part of what they were doing. Now that summer, we went to a number of crop circles in which the military showed up at. In fact, we decided to test that. We got word of a crop circle and sent it to the military, and by the time we got to the crop circle, they showed up about 20 minutes later. Clearly following that we had notified them of it. Interestingly enough, we believe that they may have been involved in hoaxing one crop circle up in the Mayville area because they were very insistent on what our take was of the crop circles in that area. And I sort of played dumb and I said, well, there were 5. Which one do you want to know about? And they said, we only knew of 3. So it turns out one of the ones, I mentioned the Kleinman crop circle from Wisconsin, I literally found that driving down the road, and that was one of the ones I did not know about. So it's always kind of a dicey thing it's sort of a side aspect of the phenomenon that I try not to get involved with and investigate and get impressions with, but there does seem to be an aspect of it. I know Linda's probably dealt with it in England a number of times, and a number of other researchers have dealt with it in England. It's hard to know what the true nature of that is.
Are you making any advances in your instrumentation? Are you working on multispectral scanning, gravimetric, other possible?
Well, that's all very expensive. And we've lost equipment in crop circles and had those electronics burn out because of the nature of what's going on there. So we're very hesitant to drop $10,000 on a multispectral scanning system and take it out there to, get fried. So we're using kind of the simplest of instruments that we can to make these determinations at this point. But if you have some spare,
I have some
30 or
suggestions.
40,000, you want to give us some
I'll give you
equipment,
some
that'd be great.
On the crop circles, have you ever heard in your investigative that anything about like ice circles or patterns in ice or snow besides crops?
Yes, the most recent one that I investigated was on January 1st of 2004. There was an ice circle in Michigan, and Linda interviewed me for that, Linda Moulton-Howe at Earth Files. If you go out to her website and sign up, I'm sure that interview is out there. Ice circles are very, very rare. There are only about, I'd say, 15 reported ever in the United States. And out of those, only 2 that had some sort of multi-component to it. The ice circle that I investigated in Michigan in 2004, it was what we call a near eyewitness case. A gentleman actually saw sort of a column of light going up into the cloud deck during a blizzard, essentially, a heavy snow shower coming down in the middle of the night, about 1:30 in the morning, and actually lasted long enough that he stuck his hand out and could measure, based on the width of his fingers or whatever, how wide that was, and triangulating that to the distance of where the ice circle was, it was exactly the same size as that ice circle. But the ice circle was obscured from his view because of a hill, and the lake was on the opposite side. Now, when an ice circle occurs, it's like there's a hole in the ice, but what happens to the trace evidence? It just goes into the lake, right? There's nothing to measure. But in this particular crop circle, or ice circle in 2004, what happened is that as the energy melted through the ice, it created sort of a steam effect, and that steam condensed around the outside of that hole in the ice, creating sort of an unusual splash pattern. And we took samples of that ice, and W.C. Levengood, biophysicist, used that water that had been sort of deposited, refrozen in that splash pattern, to test that on growing wheat seeds. And then he did a control using tap water and did a control using snow from his backyard, and found that the water used to germinate those seeds from the ice circle, again, grew faster and were more energetic than the controls. So we did end up getting some kind of evidence of which to use from that circle, which was kind of interesting. And it's the only sort of scientific investigation that's ever been done because of the nature of the ethereal nature of water in ice circles.
Do you think that like the magnetic mantle of the Earth creating like in electrical, and when you're doing making transformers and stuff, you segregate the steel and stuff to reduce the eddy currents? Do you think there's actually like maybe a possibility of eddy currents that are creating the...
I think that could be a possibility. Other people have suggested whistlers. If those people that know what whistlers are, they're sort of electromagnetic conduits that go from pole to pole in the upper ionosphere that sometimes turn and come down at lower latitudes. And that may be a source of that energy. We just don't know at this
sort
point.
of like solar flares or something like
Yeah.
similar. All right. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
You briefly mentioned having found increased radiation in some of the circles. How is that measured, and could you give us some journal, some publication where we could read about it? The radiation, was it hard radiation, soft radiation, alpha, beta, gamma? How was it measured, and what do you think was the source? Within the circle, within the soil? in sampling? What did you find it was?
Okay, that's a very good question, very technical, complex question. We now use what's known as a Gamma Scout, which can measure alpha, beta, or gamma, or all three, and it measures it digitally so that we get a very accurate readout. It's accurate to a very, very small error rate, and we have found that the increased radioactivity is on the order of 2 to 10 times the normal background radiation. So it's nothing dangerous, it's not, health adverse. The question about the source of it is harder to determine. There was a paper written by a gentleman from Oak Ridge Labs and Michael Korost, who I cited earlier at the beginning of my talk. They wrote a paper in the MUFON Journal back in the early 1990s about radionucleotides in their sampling. They unfortunately withdrew their paper because of some statistical problems, but in talking with Oak Ridge Labs, they're confident that they did detect radiation, and they did detect radionucleotides, but were unaware that Michael Korost had withdrawn the paper. So you can read about their paper. All of our information is put on our website, so you can go and download all of our reports, and you can actually read, if you want, in the appendixes of all of the readings that we've taken. We literally take hundreds of readings in these formations looking at that. Now, whether the source is coming from the plants or the soil or what it is, that's a very big mystery, because there are no sort of identifiable radionucleotides that only last about 10 days, which is about the length of time that we see that increased radiation last. The higher electromagnetic fields and radiation only seem to last for about 10 days after a crop circle occurs, and then it sort of dissipates. And we were actually at a crop circle in North Carolina with the Geiger counter running for about 2 days straight, and we could actually just watch that level go back down to normal. So there's something unusual going on there. I've talked about this with W.C. Levengood, and we have come up with a possible hypothesis. Because Geiger counters detect ionizing radiation, it's possible that the increased sort of changes in electromagnetic fields may be increasing the sensitivity of the ionizing Geiger counter and causing us to trick us into seeing higher readings than what we actually are. But we don't have, it's just a hypothesis for why we're seeing higher readings. We don't have a good answer for it at this point.
But you couldn't get any samples into a scintillation counter that fast to find out what it was, and your equipment did not tell you whether it was alpha, beta, or gamma?
We've measured it all three.
All three?
Mm-hmm.
A level of 10 times alpha radiation above background wouldn't bother me. 10 times gamma would.
Right. Like I said, it's a range between 2 and 10 times. So we're seeing fluctuations based on the formation. Every formation is unique. And so we've seen various levels, as high as 10 times, as low as 2 times.
But you have not zeroed in on a source.
Not yet.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I was wondering if you have done any research or plan into expanding along the lines that you found in the formations, or perhaps in the geometrics of the circles themselves, to see how they would correspond to other ancient sites around the world or other geometrics found in crop circles. See if there was any kind of geometric grid that might even, correspond to the ley lines or whatever, things.
Right. I think that's a very tricky line of investigation for a number of reasons. First of all, there is no generally accepted definition of what a ley line is, right? Even amongst dowsers and even the Lay Hunter magazine in England, there's no agreed upon definition of what one is. So you have that to contend with. Secondly, we're seeing that there's a relationship between a close proximity with earthworks and crop circles, but not a long distance one. or a very long distance one. So to extend those lines and look, does it point to the pyramids in Egypt or something like that? I think that correlation is hard to make meaningful. The third thing that we've had several people ask us to apply our methodology to the crop circles in England, for instance, because they have a huge conglomeration of crop circles and they have all these identifiable earthworks nearby. And the problem there is they have a serious hoaxing problem. And they've had a serious hoaxing problem for about 10 years or more that results in a very big contamination of that whole area to apply this methodology to. You can stretch a line across the landscape and you'll either hit earthworks or hoax crop circles or real crop circles or whatever. What we found in the United States is that in mapping hoaxed crop circles, not a single hoaxed crop circle has ever aligned to any other crop circle. So it really helps us in what we're studying here, that we have a sort of a pure sort of database to look at.
In England, have they been able to do any kind of alignment with the ones that are thought to be real, or does that same thing show up there?
There have been some attempts at that, but like I said, it's very challenging, and I think that any analysis of that would be very suspicious because of the nature of the data. The other thing I would suggest is if you are interested in that kind of thing, there's a very good book called The Gaia Matrix. The Gaia Matrix. And the author of that has identified something across the United States, a sort of energy line of a whole bunch of things that he calls the Great Cross of North America. And two arms of that Great Cross of North America were very, very close to the crop circle line of 2004 and 2005, coming to that point, that 90-degree angle I described. It's like two arms of that Great Cross. It was very close. He was off, maybe if we use the crop circles as real evidence, maybe off by about 60 miles from what we actually saw on the ground. Yeah.
2003, we found that ancient survey marker through the crop formation. None of us
Right.
knew it was there,
Mm-hmm.
and it was uphill. It was one of the formations that sort of came down, and we taking the lines and going all the way up. That we found the survey marker.
Yeah, one of the slides I didn't include, which I threw in at the end, is even crop circles that we find no actual earthworks at. This is one from Ted Robertson's photo of a crop circle here in Indiana back in the year 2000. It turns out that in Spencer, Indiana, I was hounding Ted, there's got to be an earthwork nearby, and he never found anything. But a couple of years after that crop circle came down, just to the south of this, a circular earthwork was discovered and excavated by Indiana University. So, crop circles know that they're there, those earthworks are there, so, it's one of those things.
Yes, any postulation on whether or not the energy differential you've discovered might be utilized by whoever or whatever? In other words, the opportunity that occurs when these fronts come through might be what's being utilized. And also regard to damage to equipment, which other researchers have had. Are there any correlations with your tests when these occur? The electromagnetic tests, et cetera, that you
So
take?
the first question is, can you use the energy in another way? Like, can it be tapped, or?
Who or what may be causing these crop circles, may be taking advantage of the occurrence of that energy differential?
Sure, I mean, we
rather
don't
than a
really
natural
know.
formation occurring geometrically.
Right, we don't really know because we don't know exactly what the source cause of crop circles is. So that's like another step down the road once we would identify that. Now, your second question has to do with
Equipment damage.
equipment damage. Have I had a lot of equipment damage?
No, correlations to the tests that you've done.
Oh, yeah, yes. Only in sites that we've had these tests that were positive, like for node elongation, is where we've had equipment failures. We haven't had anything like that in any hoax crop circle.
But I mean, at the actual time of the equipment damage, the tests that you've taken, do they correlate in any way to some energy spikes or something?
It's so rare that we've had that kind of equipment damage, it's hard to make a correlation like that. I would say it's only been a handful of times.
This will be the This will be the last question. We're
Okay.
about to run to time. So.
Thank you. I was wondering, have you noticed any correlation to not only the mounds, but any of the dry or wet quarries that might have some sort of vibrations or something on the same line as that you're following with your mounds?
No, we have not seen anything where there have been quarries nearby crop circles.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I'll be at my table if other people want to come up for questions. You can pick up a flyer for the ICCRA if you'd like. Thanks.